In early 1943, high above the Coral Sea, an American bomber lumbered through hostile airspace on what many would later describe as a voluntary suicide mission. The aircraft was a B-25 Mitchell, modified beyond standard configuration, stripped of armor in some areas and overloaded in others. Its task was brutally simple: fly deep into Japanese-controlled territory near Bougainville, photograph enemy installations, and return if possible. Escort fighters could not accompany it that far. Once the bomber crossed a certain point, it would be alone. Everyone on board understood the odds. Japanese air patrols dominated the region, and their fighter pilots were among the most experienced in the Pacific. The crew prepared themselves for interception, but none of them expected how quickly it would come. 6 Mitsubishi A6M-0s appeared like predators, faster and more agile than anything the bomber could hope to outrun. They circled methodically, positioning themselves for the kill. This was standard Japanese doctrine: swarm, isolate, and shred bombers before defensive gunners could bring their weapons to bear. Inside the American aircraft, tension tightened into silence. The gunners tracked the fighters through their sights, knowing that once the attack began, survival would depend on seconds. At the controls sat Captain Jay Zeamer Jr, an unlikely figure in this moment. He was not known for daring combat maneuvers or instinctive flying. He was known for something far less glamorous: notebooks, calculations, and questions that irritated commanding officers. An engineer by training, educated at MIT, Zeamer had earned the unflattering nickname, the Bookworm pilot. Among fighter pilots and bomber crews alike, Zeamer's reputation inspired skepticism rather than confidence. He was meticulous to a fault, endlessly studying reports that others ignored. He questioned assumptions that doctrine treated as settled fact. Many saw this as hesitation or overthinking in a profession that prized aggression and instinct. Yet Zeamer saw air combat differently. To him, speed, altitude, and formation were not just habits, they were variables, and variables he believed could be manipulated. As the 6 Zeros tightened their circle, Zeamer made a decision that went against everything bomber pilots were trained to do. Instead of pushing the engines harder or attempting evasive maneuvers, he reduced throttle. The bomber slowed. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the geometry of the attack collapsed. The Japanese fighters, expecting a steady target moving at predictable speed, overshot their firing positions. Their tight formation fractured as pilots adjusted instinctively to avoid collision. What should have been a synchronized kill dissolved into confusion. In that split second, the B-25's gunners found their opening. Defensive fire erupted, not wildly but deliberately, aimed at fighters suddenly out of position. The air around the bomber filled with tracers, smoke, and sharp turns as the attackers struggled to recover their advantage. This was not recklessness. It was calculation. Zeamer had studied combat reports that described how Japanese pilots relied heavily on speed and formation discipline. He understood that disruption, not escape, was the key. By altering his aircraft's behavior at precisely the wrong moment for his attackers, he had turned their strength into vulnerability. The crew would later recall that the Zeros seemed almost surprised, as if the rules of engagement had shifted without warning. The bomber shuddered under fire, metal tearing and fuel lines rupturing, but it stayed airborne. What unfolded above the Coral Sea was not a miracle, nor blind luck. It was the application of intellect under fire. As the fight intensified and the bomber absorbed hit after hit, one truth became clear to everyone aboard. The Bookworm pilot was not improvising. He was executing a plan born of study, patience, and a refusal to accept that doctrine was destiny. And before the battle was over, that refusal would turn certain death into something no one had expected: survival. As the engagement intensified, the scale of what Zeamer had set in motion became brutally clear. The Japanese Zeros regrouped quickly, attacking again and again from different angles, but the rhythm of the fight had changed. Their advantage in speed and maneuverability no longer translated into clean firing passes. Each approach was disrupted by the bomber's unpredictable behavior. Zeamer varied throttle settings constantly, forcing the fighters to misjudge closure rates and overshoot their targets. Inside the B-25, the crew fought for survival in a storm of noise and violence. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage, control cables snapped, fuel sprayed across compartments. One by one, systems failed. Yet the aircraft remained controllable, barely. Every man aboard knew the bomber was being shredded, but it was not breaking apart in the air the way Japanese pilots expected it to. The gunners worked with ruthless discipline. They did not fire continuously, conserving ammunition and waiting for moments when a Zero crossed their sights at the wrong speed and angle. Each disruption in the enemy's attack pattern created brief windows of opportunity. Tracers reached out, and several Japanese fighters took hits they should never have been exposed to. Smoke streamed from at least one Zero as it broke away. Others pulled off abruptly, abandoning textbook attack runs to avoid collision or return fire. What should have been 6 coordinated attackers had become individual pilots reacting under pressure. The bomber, despite taking hundreds of impacts, had inverted the engagement. It was no longer a helpless target, it was the axis around which the fight revolved. Zeamer remained locked into his method. He ignored instinctive urges to dive or climb aggressively, knowing that predictable responses would only restore the attacker's advantage. His calculations were not written on paper in that moment, but they guided every decision. Speed was adjusted not for escape, but for timing. Altitude changes were subtle, designed to distort approach vectors rather than evade them. The bomber's damaged frame groaned under stress, yet its flight path continued to deny the Zero's clean solutions. Zeamer had transformed the engagement into a problem the enemy had not trained to solve. The Japanese pilots, elite by any standard, had been conditioned to dominate bomber formations through speed and precision. Against a lone aircraft behaving irrationally, slowing when it should flee, holding course when it should brake, they were forced into improvisation. Improvisation under fire carried risk. Formation discipline collapsed entirely. Attacks became staggered and hesitant. Each second the bomber remained airborne increased the cost of the engagement for the attackers. This was the hidden flaw Zeamer had identified long before the mission. Doctrine worked best against obedience. Against deviation, it faltered. Inside the B-25, the damage was catastrophic. Over 500 bullet and shell holes riddled the aircraft. Hydraulic systems were gone, instruments were unreadable, crew members were wounded, some seriously. Yet morale held, driven by the unmistakable realization that the plan was working. Survival was no longer impossible, it was conditional. Every disrupted pass, every overshoot, every missed firing angle bought time, and time, Zeamer knew, was the only currency that mattered. The Zeros eventually disengaged, low on ammunition and fuel, their opportunity lost. The bomber limped away from the battle zone, battered beyond recognition, but still flying. For the crew, the fight was not yet over. Getting home would be another ordeal entirely. But in the aftermath of the attack, one thing was undeniable. What had saved them was not superior firepower or luck. It was preparation. Zeamer's willingness to question doctrine, to treat air combat as a system rather than a contest of instinct, had turned 6 hunters into a disorganized threat. Above the Coral Sea, the Bookworm pilot had proven something no training manual yet acknowledged, that intellect, applied at the right moment, could be as lethal and as protective as any weapon ever mounted on an aircraft. The bomber's escape from the immediate engagement did not bring relief. The aircraft was barely holding together, and every control input risked triggering a catastrophic failure. Zeamer assessed the situation with the same analytical calm that had guided him through the fight. Instruments were damaged or unreadable, hydraulics were gone, and fuel was leaking steadily. Several crew members were wounded, yet still at their stations. There was no question of abandoning the aircraft. Over open water and deep behind enemy lines, survival depended on keeping the B-25 airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. Zeamer adjusted power carefully, compensating for damage asymmetrically, feeling the aircraft rather than trusting gauges. Every decision was deliberate. Rash corrections would tear the bomber apart. What mattered now was stability. As they limped away from Bougainville, the crew took stock of the damage. Control surfaces were riddled with holes. Entire sections of the fuselage were shredded. One engine showed signs of imminent failure. The fact that the aircraft had survived the engagement at all seemed improbable. Yet the deeper significance of what had happened was already beginning to take shape in Zeamer's mind. The battle had confirmed what he had suspected from reading after-action reports and obscure technical analyses. Fighter pilots relied heavily on expectation. They anticipated bombers to behave in predictable ways, maintaining speed, holding course, reacting instinctively to attack. By violating those expectations, Zeamer had forced experienced pilots into hesitation and error. It was not the slowing itself that mattered. It was the timing. Hours later, as the bomber finally approached Allied-controlled airspace, exhaustion set in. The crew had been operating at maximum stress for far longer than training scenarios ever simulated. Yet the aircraft continued to respond, fragile but obedient. When they landed, ground crews stared in disbelief. The B-25 was barely recognizable. More than 500 impacts scarred its surface. Some sections looked as though they had been clawed open. It was immediately clear that this was not a story of ordinary survival. This was something else entirely. Debriefings followed quickly. Intelligence officers, flight commanders, and engineers crowded around the aircraft and its crew. They wanted to know how it had survived an encounter that should have been fatal within minutes. Zeamer did not dramatize his explanation. He described his decisions plainly, almost clinically. He spoke about overshoot angles, closure rates, and the psychological effect of disrupting formation discipline. To some listeners, it sounded abstract. To others, especially engineers and tacticians, it was revelatory. What Zeamer described was not luck. It was repeatable behavior grounded in physics and human expectation. At first, skepticism persisted. Combat aviation culture valued aggression and instinct. Slowing down in the face of attack sounded counterintuitive, even dangerous. But the physical evidence was impossible to ignore. The aircraft had survived, the crew had survived, and the engagement data supported Zeamer's account. Fighter overshoots, broken attack runs, and exposure to defensive fire aligned precisely with his explanation. Slowly, resistance gave way to curiosity. Within weeks, Zeamer's experience began circulating through quiet channels, not as a headline tactic, but as a case study. Engineers and instructors examined the engagement closely. Questions that had once annoyed superiors were now being asked more seriously. What if bomber survivability was not just about armor and guns? What if timing, throttle control, and deviation from expectation could be taught? Zeamer never claimed to have discovered a universal solution. He understood that every engagement was different, but he had demonstrated something crucial. Doctrine was not immutable. It was a starting point, not a law. In the skies above the Coral Sea, intellect had disrupted habit, and habit had failed under pressure. What began as a lone bomber's fight for survival was quietly becoming something larger, a challenge to how air combat was understood. The Bookworm pilot had not rewritten the rulebook in a single day, but he had proven that the margins between life and death could be widened by thought as much as by firepower. And in a war defined by attrition, those margins mattered more than anyone yet realized. As Zeamer's account spread through select operational and technical circles, its impact grew quietly rather than dramatically. There were no official announcements and no immediate doctrinal shifts announced from the top. Instead, the story circulated in briefing rooms, training discussions, and engineering evaluations, places where ideas were tested before they were accepted. Instructors at bomber training units began referencing the engagement as an example of how expectation shaped combat outcomes. Engineers examined how throttle control, aircraft mass, and speed differentials influenced fighter behavior. What had once been dismissed as academic thinking was now being treated as practical knowledge, forged under fire. Zeamer's survival had forced a reevaluation of assumptions that had governed bomber tactics since the early days of the war. The key insight was deceptively simple. Fighter pilots trained to intercept bombers relied on prediction. Their attack runs were built around expected speeds and trajectories. When those expectations were violated at the wrong moment, even elite pilots were forced into reactive decision-making. That reaction cost time and precision. Zeamer's maneuver had not neutralized the enemy's skill, but it had interrupted its application. Training officers began to explore how such disruption could be incorporated into bomber defense doctrine without encouraging recklessness. The emphasis shifted from copying the maneuver itself to understanding the principle behind it. Deviate deliberately. Force the attacker to solve a new problem under pressure. This shift aligned with a broader evolution in air warfare. As the war progressed, both sides learned that rigid doctrine could become a liability. Flexibility, once viewed as improvisation, was increasingly recognized as a form of discipline in its own right. Zeamer's experience fit this emerging pattern. It demonstrated that preparation did not always mean memorizing procedures. Sometimes it meant understanding why those procedures existed and when they might fail. For bomber crews flying increasingly dangerous missions deep into enemy territory, that understanding could mean the difference between destruction and survival. Zeamer himself remained an unlikely symbol of this change. He did not seek attention, nor did he present himself as a visionary. His contribution lay in persistence rather than charisma. He had asked uncomfortable questions long before his mission over Bougainville. He had studied reports others skimmed. He had trusted analysis when instinct urged conformity. In doing so, he embodied a shift that the war increasingly demanded: the integration of intellect into combat decision-making. As bomber losses mounted elsewhere, commanders looked for any edge that could reduce attrition. Armor could be added, guns could be improved, escorts could be extended. But tactics that increased survivability without additional weight or resources were especially valuable. Zeamer's engagement offered precisely that. It did not promise invulnerability. It offered disruption, and disruption, applied at the right moment, could save lives. By late 1943, elements of Zeamer's thinking had filtered into training syllabi and tactical discussions. Bomber crews were encouraged to think more actively about how their aircraft appeared to attackers, not just as platforms, but as moving problems. Speed was no longer treated solely as something to maximize. It became something to manage. Timing, once secondary, gained prominence. These were subtle changes, but in aggregate they mattered. What had begun as a lone crew's fight above the Coral Sea was now influencing how hundreds of crews approached combat. The transformation was not immediate or universal. Resistance remained. Combat culture does not change easily, especially under stress. But the evidence was compelling. Survival rates improved incrementally. Engagements unfolded differently. Fighters overshot more often. Gunners found better opportunities. Zeamer's refusal to follow the manual had not overturned doctrine overnight. It had done something more durable. It had inserted doubt into assumptions that no longer deserved certainty. And in a war where adaptation determines survival, that doubt was not weakness. It was strength, earned at 10,000 feet under fire. What made Zeamer's action so powerful was its simplicity. He did not invent a complex maneuver or depend on perfect conditions. He changed one variable at the moment it mattered most. That single decision forced 6 enemy fighters to abandon coordination and fight individually, stripping them of their greatest advantage. The lesson resonated far beyond bomber crews. It underscored a broader truth of modern warfare. Superiority was not just a matter of speed, firepower, or numbers, but of adaptability. As the war progressed, this principle appeared again and again, in different theaters and different forms. Those who questioned assumptions survived longer than those who followed them blindly. Zeamer himself never framed his experience as a rejection of discipline. On the contrary, He believed deeply in preparation. His approach was rooted in study, repetition, and understanding. He trusted analysis because he had invested the time to master it. The irony was that this made him appear unconventional in a culture that equated courage with instinct. Yet his actions proved that intellect under pressure was not hesitation, it was control. The crew he brought home alive understood this better than anyone. For them, the difference between death and survival had not been bravery alone, but thought applied at precisely the right moment. The legacy of that mission extended quietly through the remainder of the war. Bomber tactics continued to evolve, shaped by many influences, but the principle Zeamer demonstrated endured. Crews were encouraged to think dynamically, to recognize patterns in enemy behavior, and to understand that predictability was often the greatest danger. Training emphasized not just what to do, but why. This shift did not eliminate losses, but it reduced them. And in a war fought at industrial scale, even small improvements saved hundreds of lives. In hindsight, it is tempting to romanticize the story as a moment of lone genius, but that misses its deeper meaning. Zeamer's success was not accidental. It was the product of curiosity, preparation, and a willingness to challenge accepted wisdom. He did not reject the manual out of arrogance. He rejected it because he understood its limits. When those limits were exposed, he acted not impulsively, but deliberately. The story of the Bookworm pilot endures because it captures a truth that extends beyond aviation or even war. Systems are built on assumptions. When those assumptions go unexamined, they become vulnerabilities. Zeamer survived because he examined them. Above the Coral Sea, under impossible odds, intellect became a weapon, not against machinery but against expectation itself. What happened that day did not make headlines. It did not change the course of the war overnight, but it quietly reshaped how survival was understood in the air. And for the men who flew into danger afterward, armed with a little more knowledge and a little more doubt, that change was everything.